Welcome back to week 3. This means you've gotten through week 1 and week 2, which is good because you've probably been through at least the first 6-7 chapters in the book. You've got a good handle on what's going on, and you're probably entering the formative part of writing your paper. So I wanted to check back in with you and take this opportunity to sort of emphasize a couple of different things. These are important concepts, and these are difficult concepts to understand when we were talking about impact evaluations in program evaluation. And some of this will be covered again in your research methods class that you will take a little later on in the program. But the fact remains is that you've got to understand some of these basic concepts now. So just want to take a couple seconds, or probably more like minutes, to explain them to you. So first, when we assess program impact, this is probably the most difficult thing to do, or one of the most difficult things to do. Is the program that I'm evaluating, is my outpatient drug treatment program actually working? And remember what I said in lecture 1. What exactly does work mean? Well, when you are assessing the impact of a program, it's usually best to build this evaluation function into the design of a new program rather than coming in behind the fact or coming into a program that's been going on for a while and trying to figure out retrospectively what's working and what's not. Although that's possible, and it happens on a regular basis. But the fact remains is that if you have the opportunity to build in an impact evaluation from the beginning of a new program, it's probably best to do that. When you're designing a program evaluation that's looking at the impact of the program, you have to use experimental design. And experimental design is one of those things that's really tricky for students to get a handle on, but it's really important to understand. So, as you can see from this slide, what I'm talking about, what's experimental design? Well, experimental research design must include a control and experimental group, a pre and a post-test, and random assignment. So, using our outpatient drug treatment program as an example, they are the treatment intervention. That is, the treatment intervention is the actual program itself. The people that are in that program are the experimental group. If you were doing, one way to do a program evaluation in this context would be to compare your experimental group, the group getting the intervention, i.e. the group in drug treatment, with a similar group of people that did not receive the intervention. But when you're talking about a completely experimental design, you are using random assignment. So this would mean that before you ever started the drug treatment program, you would need to have someone who, like yourself for instance, as the evaluator, who would randomly assign people to either take part or not take part in the drug treatment program. When you use random assignment, you minimize the amount of bias that you may find, that you may have in your sample group. And again, these are concepts that we will be covering in more detail in research methods, and I know that this book goes into it in some detail, and so I suggest that you read those sections carefully. But random assignment is the hallmark of a truly experimental design. So if you've got people taking part in your treatment group, and if you've got people taking part in your control group, the people who didn't receive the intervention, and if people were randomly assigned to one of those two groups, you have to have what's called a pretest, that is the test that you give before they start the treatment program or before they start the project, and then the post-test, which is the test that they take after the program is over. What you're looking to measure is change over time. You're looking to see whether there is a difference between the experimental and control group between the first time they took the test and the second time they took the test. And when I say test, I don't mean multiple choice or short answer test like you would in school. I mean looking at various data parameters or data markers to see whether or not did your treatment group improve or not compared with the control group prior to program and then after program. Okay, so your experimental research design must include those 3 things. It is unfortunately not always possible to randomly assign people to treatment groups, especially when you're talking about drug treatment. It's actually unethical to provide some people with the opportunity to take part in programming and others not, just because you've been randomly assigned not to get it. It would really be an unethical thing to do. So what we have to do, what we resort to when we can't have a perfectly pristine study is we do what's called quasi-experimental research. And that does not involve random assignment. What it does do is it requires equal comparison or equivalent comparison between the two groups. So you have a treatment group still, the group that receives the intervention, the group that takes part in drug treatment, and then you have the comparison group, which is a group very much like the treatment group, but a group that was not randomly assigned to be the control group. And so the comparison group is usually matched on various criteria to the treatment group. Could be based on age, could be based on gender, could be based on sentence, could be based on length served in prison, could be any number of things. That's the difference between an experimental design and a quasi-experimental design. Experimental research design is the gold standard. It's what we want, it's what we wish for, but quasi-experimental research design is really what we often get and what we have to settle for. Randomization is preferred, but matching or near equivalence for comparison groups is really the reality of what we're talking about here. Experimental and quasi-experimental research designs are not always ideal for new programs, but sometimes, of course, as I said when I started this lecture, it's often best to try to build them into programs. Just because you build them into a program that you might start doesn't mean that you're going to start that evaluation right away. You have to give the program time to start. You have to give the program time to work out some of its operational and processual kinks. And so usually what happens is you need to wait a period of time before the evaluation begins. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't use forethought to actually think about evaluating a program at the time that you develop it. Of course, one of the things that you have to think about when you're doing an impact evaluation or any evaluation is the time and cost associated with it and the experimental integrity. You want your experiment to be valid, you want your results to be reliable, and you want, at the end of the day, for your study, your program evaluation, to be empirically rigorous. And so that's something that you really, really need to think about. When we look at issues in designing program impact evaluations, you've got to look at bias that could be associated in measuring program effect. Is there any bias in your study? That may not be apparent to you on the face of it, but you've got to really evaluate the situation and think that through. Selection bias, meaning is your comparison group different substantially from your treatment group? Because if so, your results will not be valid. Were there interfering events that occurred during the treatment program, during your program evaluation? In other words, did the treatment group receive added treatment over and above what the treatment provided because, I don't know, the program got extra money to start something new? That's not what you started out to evaluate, and so if you include the results of that extra treatment or that extra dosage, if you will, then what you're going to find is your results aren't valid compared with your comparison group. And then what you've got to always think about doing is using statistical techniques to equate your groups, especially if you're looking at treatment and comparison groups, by controlling for differences related to age or gender or sentence type or whatever. Finally, of course, I'm sure none of you want to hear this, but one of the things that you've got to do is figure out the best statistical technique to use for your program design. When you do impact evaluations, you can't do one without them. That is, you can't do one without statistics. So you want to look at pre and post studies. Are you measuring? You're measuring change over time. So you're probably doing t-tests or you're doing ANOVAs. If you're looking at throwing a bunch of variables into the program and seeing what comes out as impacting outcome, then you might be doing multiple regression analyses and a host or logistical regression analyses. But you'd be doing a regression of some kind. If you were doing time series design, if you were measuring the impact of the program over a series of periods in time, then that's a whole other realm of statistical analysis. So you really need to be able to identify what kind of program impact evaluation you're doing based on your experimental design, and then look, of course, at what statistical techniques you would use. And at the end of the day, a strong study design with good data will yield meaningful results. I always tell my students, garbage in is garbage out. The data you get out is only as good as the data you put in. If the program evaluation design that you've set up is not solid, if it doesn't address what it is you want it to address, then the results that you get are not going to be meaningful in any way. So take these aren't warnings, but take this information and move forward with it as you move through the rest of the chapters. And we'll meet again in week 4 when I try to button up some issues for you.